This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
That is, man lived before he came to this earth. He is an eternal being. Joseph Smith gave to the world the true understanding of the origin of man, that man comes to earth with a divine and eternal purpose.
Let's examine the doctrine.
And through it, all who believe and obey the glorious gospel of God, all who are true and faithful and overcome the world, all who suffer for Christ and his word,
all of it,
all shall become as their Maker and sit with him on his throne and reign with him forever in everlasting glory.
And see what it has to offer.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished and love of God and neighbor rules the world. In the name of Jesus Christ.
What can be gleaned from Mormon teachings?
A corollary to the pernicious falsehood that God is dead is the equally pernicious doctrine that there is no devil. Satan himself is the father of both of these lies. To believe them is to surrender to him.
And where is the church heading?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you to become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome back. The last couple of weeks we've been studying Martin Harris, aka Not So Smarty Marty. We found out he was a visionary man that was highly susceptible to the power of suggestion from on high. We watched him get swindled out of his money for the print of the Book of Mormon, get in fights with his wife about money, during which he beat the hell out of her multiple times and kicked her out of his house. We watched his marriage spiral into divorce after an affair with the neighbor's wife, which he didn't even seem to try to hide from his wife, Lucy, and that was pretty much where we left off. While there's a lot more to cover when it comes to Marty, we can't get too caught up in it for now. We will see this character develop more and more as the timeline continues, but if we keep going with him, we advance the timeline past other much more prominent character introductions, and that is unacceptable. So we'll close off the Marty line for now, in an effort to examine the next big hitter in the foundation of the church, Oliver Cowdery, or as we'll come to know him, Cowdung Allover, or just Cowdung for short. Before we talk about Cowdung himself, we need to bring up a whole new subject, as it offers some background on the connection between the Cowdery family and the Smith family. We will set our scene in southwest Vermont in the 1790s. Our focus momentarily lies on a radical Zionist sect called the New Israelites, which was founded by Nathaniel Wood in Rutland, Vermont. This is from Wikipedia. Wood declared his followers modern Israelites, and the group practiced a strict dietary code, as they understood to be instructed in the Law of Moses. Like most radical sects, the group displayed spiritual gifts and made prophecies. At one point, the group began building a temple, although the project was eventually abandoned. They also believed in speaking in the angelic tongue, which meant babbling what they thought was ancient Hebrew, and they engaged in polygamy, using dowsing rods to hunt for treasure, and divination to receive divine revelation. Seem familiar? Well, William Cowdery, Cowdung's dad, and Big Daddy Cheese, Joseph Smith's dad, were both members of this radical sect. In fact, Big Daddy Cheese was one of the, quote, leading rodsmen in the sect, meaning people there looked up to him because somehow his magic vision was better than everybody else's magic vision, I guess. He may have even taught William Cowdery a thing or two in the world of scrying while they were out hunting for treasure in this cult. So what does this connection mean? First off, Lucy Mack Smith, Joe's mother, was third cousins with Cowdung. Lucy and Big Daddy Cheese didn't even know each other before the time in this religious sect, as they would be married in 1796. However, Lucy was living a mere 50 miles away from the Cowderys in the same small town as William Cowdery's uncle and Big Daddy Cheese. It isn't necessarily documented this way, partly because so few documents exist during this time, but I believe that William Cowdery set up Lucy Mack and Big Daddy Cheese on one of their dowsing outings near Turnbridge, Vermont, where they were living. It is documented, however, that the Smiths and the Cowderys both attended a congregational church in Poultney, Vermont, after this radical sect broke up in 1802. All of that information may seem insignificant at the moment, but eventually it will matter when it comes to the authorship of the Book of Mormon. So now that we have established an initial connection between the Smiths and the Cowderys, let's talk about the man of the hour. Cowdung Allover was born on October 3rd, 1806, so he was just barely a year younger than Joseph Smith. He was born in Wells, Vermont, to William and Rebecca Fuller Cowdery, into a family of 8 siblings at the time. His mother, Rebecca, died when Cowdung was just 2, leaving the family traumatized and motherless. Luckily, William, his dad, was quick on the rebound and married a widow by the name of Keziah Pierce, who had a son of her own at the time. She had been married to her husband, previous to William, for 3 years, and he died soon after the birth of their first and only son. So this was a widow/widower match made in untimely spouse death hell, I suppose. The new happy couple had 3 more kids, while the oldest kids were periodically moving away to be on their own, and this is where the story of Cowdung really comes to fruition. Cowdung Allover was a very bright young child who reportedly began going to school in 1813. While it may not have been a formal schooling, it was at very least a literary heavy apprenticeship that he used the knowledge from later on in his life. He eventually landed a couple of jobs in New York as a typesetter in a couple of printing presses for some quick cash. That was during the years 1822 to 1824. He was known to be quite charismatic as well as intelligent and steeped in the Bible during his prime years. It can be speculated that Cowdung spent some time living in the Smith household during his time typesetting. The speculation is drawn from the fact that his parents were very possibly familiar with the Smiths and possibly friendly prior to his time as a typesetter, and that Cowdung was working in Canandaigua, Ontario, New York, which was less than 10 miles from where the Smith family lived at this time. I believe that Joe and Cowdung became quite well acquainted at this time, even though there isn't any documentation explicitly detailing interactions between the two. But the thing that is most intriguing is Cowdung's job previous to typesetting in New York. Before he moved to Canandaigua, he was living in Poultney, Vermont with his family and working as a printer's devil/assistant typesetter at a company called the Poultney Gazette. The Poultney Gazette was a fairly successful printing and publishing company that had recently taken a job from a minister in the area named Ethan Smith to publish a book he had recently written. The book was called A View of the Hebrews, and there is strong evidence that Cowdung was one of the workers at the press during the time it was published. I can't really get into the rabbit hole of the View of the Hebrews, as it will be a large discussion by itself in a soon-to-come episode. Besides the fact that it would derail the whole Cowdung Allover subject, which is much more important right now. But what you need to know right now is Ethan Smith published View of the Hebrews in 1823, which is a book detailing the origins of the Native Americans as having emigrated from Israel. Not only that, but Ethan Smith was also minister for the Cowdery's church at the time, and had been for 2 years prior. Quite soon after the book was published, Cowdung moved to Canandaigua, New York, in late 1823, and here is where our story continues. Cowdung Allover was typesetter in the Burned-Over district in New York through 1824. We brushed over this when we talked about Joseph Smith, but just to recap, this was a time of constant religious awakenings and revivals. Luckily for local publishing companies, all the religious sects that were cropping up had information they needed printed and distributed. In those days, if a typesetter wasn't making enough money at his job, he could supplement his income by taking small payments from the people who were paying to publish the documents and distributing them for a small fee, or even selling them and taking a commission. This was also a great way to meet a lot of people and get your name and profession out there. They didn't exactly have Monster.com, so networking was a much more arduous and time-consuming task at this time. Well, that's what Cowdung did. He made a commission from selling religious pamphlets and books to people, not only in New York, but also south to Pennsylvania and west to Ohio. One of the main areas Cowdung may have spent time in was Pittsburgh, as it was a burgeoning city and trading hub connecting the East Coast to the currently settling Ohio. Sidney Rigdon was a pastor of the First Baptist Church in Pittsburgh when Cowdung would have been visiting the city's holy folk to distribute Jesus propaganda. I just mentioned a name for the first time, Sidney Rigdon. This guy, I should be doing the entire podcast about just him because he almost plays a larger role than Joe does in the foundation of the church. But alas, the podcast is about Mormonism in general, so I'll have to reserve talking about him until the time is right. All we need to understand is Cowdung very possibly met this man, Sidney Rigdon, in Pittsburgh around 1824 to 1825. Not to mention that Erastus, Cowdung's older brother, lived a mere 9 miles away from Sidney Rigdon from 1820 to 1822, probably attending the same church as Rigdon, illustrating another possible connection between Cowdung and Sidney Rigdon. So, Rigdon aside, let's continue talking about Cowdung. After his job as a printer/distributor of Jesus papers, he kind of floated around for a year, attending multiple religious revivals in Palmyra and Rochester and the entire burned over district. It's highly likely that Joe was attending a lot of these as well, which is something I will provide evidence for when we get into the authorship of the Book of Mormon. It was also possible that Sidney Rigdon was at some of these revivals because he was gaining some notoriety in the area for his pastoral works. And with the opening of the Erie Canal, Pittsburgh, where Rigdon was living, and Palmyra, near where Joe was living at the time, were barely 2 days of travel apart, giving Sidney, Cowdung, and Joe relatively easy access to each other. Cowdung must have ran short on cash because his time of jobless spiritual seeking was overturned by the need for a living. So he allegedly worked to prepare a printer's manuscript for a man by the name of William Morgan in late 1825 to mid 1826 at the Batavia Advocate. William Morgan was an author who was trying to publish a book that revealed a lot of the secrets of Freemasonry, entitled Illustrations of Masonry. It's very possible that Cowdung introduced Joe and William to each other around this time as he was possibly becoming well acquainted with both of them. This connection will come to play a part much later with Joe, so tuck it in the back of your mind for now. The Freemasons in this area really must not have liked this William Morgan character and the slander he was trying to print, because he was arrested on September 11th, 1826, and went missing 8 days later. His body was never recorded, but what happened isn't much of a mystery, especially because the Batavia Advocate was burned to the ground while it was printing the book in August before William was arrested. So the Masons had a pretty powerful influence at the time if they took a man from state custody and just made him disappear. That being said, Cowdung learned everything there was to know about Masons during this time working for William Morgan. Preparing a printer's copy of a book is a very arduous task. The typesetter must read every individual line multiple times to proofread and eliminate any errors the author may not have already caught, kind of like preparing a script for a podcast. So Cowdung not only knew what was in this book, but he also had to talk with the author on a daily occasion to make sure he wasn't changing the context of anything the book contained. While this seems like a moot point to anybody that doesn't know the true history of the church, it does come to play a massive role later on. In my introductory episode, I listed a bunch of things that Joseph was, as quoted by D. Michael Quinn. One of those points was, Joseph was an anti-Mason turned master Mason. The similarities between Freemasonry and the LDS Church are absolutely unbelievable, but that isn't something we can dive into just yet, as it will be an episode all by itself. Anyway, so this William Morgan guy probably gets his throat cut and dropped in the river, and Cowdung is out of work. So in late 1826, early 1827, Cowdung goes to work as a lowly store clerk, making barely minimum wage at the time. He probably went from like 12 cents an hour to 7 cents an hour or something to that effect. Anybody that goes from a think tank position like an editor to a cashier at a store doesn't want to stay there long, and this is what happened to Cowdung. The Manchester, New York School Board of Trustees needed a schoolmaster position filled. Conveniently enough, Hiram Smith Joe's brother and bestest buddy was on the board of trustees. Originally, Lyman Cowdery, Cowdung's brother, was offered the position. He reportedly accepted the position, but then immediately declined in lieu of Cowdung taking over the position. And that's exactly what happened. Cowdung became schoolmaster in late 1828, at which time he moved in with the Smith family. When I say the Smith family, I only mean Lucy, Big Daddy Cheese, and the remaining siblings at home. Remember, Joe and Eva were living in Pennsylvania during this time. But while Cowdung Allover is staying in their home, Big Daddy Cheese takes this lovely opportunity to tell Cowdung all about the plates. Once Cowdung learns all about this book, he reportedly asks the Lord if this is the work he should have Cowdung do. And we can speculate that he received a positive answer. During the time Cowdung was staying with the Smith family, Joe actually visited home. He was in Pennsylvania with his new wife trying to translate with some makeshift scribes, but decided on a whim to come visit home while Cowdung was staying there. This was arguably the occasion that Lucy Smith, Joe's mom, asked Abigail Harris, Marty's cousin, for some money so Joe could take the coach home to visit. Remember, we talked about that in episode 3 before we read Lucy, Marty's wife's testimony on the situation. There's no real documentation to back this up, but the timeline does fit in perfectly. So I do want to interject my own understanding of the situation here because we have been slogging through a lot of information and there are a lot of conclusions that can be drawn up to this point. The reported church history has Cowdung entering right here with no prior mention. They merely report that he was a school teacher looking for his true calling in life. When I was doing the research for this episode, I watched a clip from the Joseph Smith movie that's currently playing in the Joseph Smith Center in Salt Lake City. The clip illustrated Cowdung approaching Big Daddy Cheese out of the blue and asking him about the work Joe was up to. Big Daddy Cheese tells him that Joe is doing God's work, translating an ancient record, and is in need of a scribe. Cowdung tells Big Daddy Cheese that he feels like God has impressed it upon his soul that this should be his calling in the restoration of the true gospel. And Big Daddy Cheese responds with, "If this is truly what the Lord wants for you, he will make it known." And then it pretty much just cuts to Cowdung praying in his room. After the scene in the room, the movie sort of ambles towards a scene that shows Cowdung approaching Joe out of the blue, saying, "The Lord has told me that I should serve as your scribe." This seems to be completely unfounded. I mean, if some random guy walking in the desert shows up to the mouth of the cave Muhammad is in when he's tripping balls and revelating the Quran into existence, and that weird motherfucker says, "Hey, you need any help in there?" I kind of doubt Muhammad would have just said, "Okay, come right down some of this crazy shit that's falling out of my mouth." But in the movie, after Cowdung approaches Joe, the very next scene has both of them sitting at a table with the plates out in plain sight. And Joseph says, "All right, I think that's enough for the day," as he covers the plates up. The church film says nothing about Lucy Smith and Cowdung being third cousins, and seems to actively report that Cowdung and Joe didn't know each other until early April 1829 when this scene transpires. They say nothing about the earlier visit in late 1828 when Joe took the coach home. But what of all this previous history that the Cowdery and the Smith family had together? We have record of the two families being in close proximity on multiple occasions during Joe and Cowdung's upbringing, and the two families even attended the same church for a while. Additionally, the fathers of the families were in the same scrying and divination cult for a little while. Big Daddy Cheese was even revered as a bit of a higher up in the cult because his dowsing and scrying were so accurate, allegedly. Cowdung and Joe may have even attended some of the same religious revivals in Palmyra and Rochester in their late teens and early 20s. They have plenty more meetings that we can speculate on but can't necessarily prove as fact. But why would the church divorce Joe and Cowdung prior to 1829? I would offer that it's because something is being disguised. Now, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist here, so at least hear me out. Since the beginning of this episode, I have tried to provide enough evidence to show that there were multiple times that Cowdung and Joe could have come together for collusion at some level. And let's consider the evidence for and against Joe's access to the book, A View of the Hebrews. I plan on showing in later episodes a strong correlation between the content of View of the Hebrews and the Book of Mormon, but let's just consider the basic storyline. Ethan Smith wrote about the lost tribes of Israel being the primary ancestors of the Native Americans, as well as dozens of other similarities when his book and the Book of Mormon are juxtaposed. But his book was published in 1823, and it even underwent a second edition of print, meaning it was quite a popular book in the whole Northeast region. My point is, I believe Cowdung knew Joe and might have even given him the book by Ethan Smith. But just in case he didn't, it seems like the View of the Hebrews was made available to most consumers by mid 1823, giving Joe 4 years until he started quote unquote translating to read View of the Hebrews and synthesize his own story from its pages. So maybe Joe did receive divine revelation about an idea that was fairly popular around the area at the time. In fact, Joe announced he had received revelation from God about the ancient inhabitants of this continent a mere 101 days after the release of the View of the Hebrews. That seems oddly coincidental, doesn't it? Remember how I mentioned earlier that the church today teaches that Joe and Cowdung didn't know each other whatsoever before they officially met and started translating in spring 1829? Let's answer why that is. Because that's what Joe and Cowdung claim. Let me tell you what I mean. This is straight from the LDS.org website. Quote, after Joseph Smith allowed Martin Harris to take the 116 Book of Mormon manuscript pages, which Martin lost, the plates and Joseph gift to translate were taken from him. After repenting and humbling himself in prayer, the plates were returned to him with the promise that someone would come to help him with the translation. And this is from the Joseph Smith History, chapter 1, verse 66. On the 5th day of April, 1829, Oliver Cowdery came to my house, until which time I had never seen him. He stated to me that having been teaching school in the neighborhood where my father resided, and my father being one of those who sent to the school, he went to board for a season at his house, and while there the family related to him the circumstances of my having received the plates, and accordingly he had come to make inquiries of me. 2 days after the arrival of Mr. Cowdery, being the 7th of April, I commenced to translate the Book of Mormon, and he began to write for me. So there is no mention of them making acquaintances any time before them, nothing about the same bloodline, nothing. Let's hear what Cowdung has to say about April 5th, 1829. Quote, this was the afternoon when my natural eyes for the first time beheld this brother. That's Joseph Smith, Jr. That was at Isaac Hale Farm in Harmony, Susquehanna, Pennsylvania. Now, I'm not a parent, but I remember being a kid. If my parents asked if I did something wrong, I would say, no, Mom, I didn't throw the cat down the stairs, and they would know to check the cat for broken bones. In much the same way, during the Emma interview in episode 2, remember this question? Quote, question, what about the revelation on polygamy? Did Joseph Smith have anything like it? What of spiritual wifery? Answer, there was no revelation on either polygamy or spiritual wives. There were some rumors or something of the sort, of which I asked my husband. He assured me that all there was of it was that in a chat about plural wives he had said, well, such a system might possibly be if everybody was agreed to it, and would behave as they should, but they would not, and besides it was contrary to the will of heaven. No such thing as polygamy or spiritual wifery was taught, publicly or privately, before my husband's death that I have now or ever had any knowledge of. And that was just a direct, blatant lie. Denial. That's the point that I'm getting at right now. I think we know for a fact that both Mormons and non-Mormons were well aware that Mormons at that time were a very sexually open community. And this is just completely bold-faced denial, and it's completely cardboard. I believe that Joe and Cowdung were doing the same thing about their relationship prior to the translation. The simple fact that Cowdung's old pastor was the author of View of the Hebrews was a damning enough connection that Joe and Cowdung didn't want the general populace making that connection. If somebody in that day could prove that the Book of Mormon was plagiarized from the View of the Hebrews, it would be the death of the early Mormon church. But most people in that time would perhaps buy one book per year, if that. Apparently not enough people read the books side by side to compare, because not a single person today has heard of a View of the Hebrews unless they're studying anti-Mormon literature. Whereas for some reason, most people in technology-driven today's society have at very least heard of the Mormons and their special Bible, even if it was just in reference to good old Mitt Romney. Unfortunately for Ethan Smith, he wasn't radical or polarizing enough, nor was his book, to get the world's attention, but Joe and the Book of Mormon were, and here we are today, 185 years later, trying to debunk the most capitalistic New World religion in all its festering glory. All I can say is look at the evidence and see if you come to the same conclusion that I do. Oliver Cowdery and Joseph Smith knew all along what the source material for the Book of Mormon would be, and they never thought enough people would have read the View of the Hebrews to call them out on their plagiarism. So Joe and Cowdung cooked up a new version with enough original content to obscure the origin of the storyline. That is a conclusion that follows the facts and doesn't require divine revelation from God to explain the authorship of the Book of Mormon, in the way the Golden Plates version of the story does that the LDS Church proposes. Let's look at some more evidence. Joe and Emma had recently married, and Not So Smarty Marty had paid to move them to Emma's parents' house. They later moved into their own small cabin on an adjacent property to the Hales house, and it's here, in this cabin in Harmony, Pennsylvania, that Cowdung became the chief scribe for Joe. It's a good thing that Cowdung knew how to read and write at a professional level, because the translation up to that point had been trudging along at about a half to 1 page per day, slower than cold shit on a winter morning. When Cowdung came to live with Joe and Emma, they were suddenly translating 5 to 8 pages per day. That slow winter morning shit just became angry Mexican food shit, and the Book of Mormon was translated, aka authored, in about 2 months once Cowdung came along. Cowdung and Joe reportedly began their translation after the account of Lehi, which was the lost 116 pages. What I mean is they started partway through, after where Joe had translated with Not So Smarty Marty, then went all the way to the end. After they were done, they went back and translated the account of Nephi, which became the replacement for the lost 116 pages at the very end of their time translating. I believe they did this to make the story of Lehi, which Marty and Joe translated, fit in with the rest of the narrative that Oliver and Joe were translating. Also, they were probably trying to gain their collective writing style so it could be consistent in the storyline when they did rewrite Lehi into Nephi from Joe's memory. It's really hard to try and paint a picture of exactly how the Book of Mormon was getting translated at this time. However, we do know a few things. 1. Joe had Cowdung and David Whitmer as scribes during this time. I know we haven't talked about David Whitmer much, but next episode will be all about him. We'll do a similar analysis of him that we've done of Cowdung for this episode, and we'll find out how he fits into the authorship of the Book of Mormon. But back to the translation. The second thing we know about it is the speed of the translation greatly increased when Cowdung and David came to help Joe scribe. Up to this point, Emma, her brother, and Joe's brother Hiram were scribes, and the translation was not going fast enough. Once the Dream Team came in, they wrote 350 some pages. This sudden burst of inspiration in the translation had to be explained somehow. A believing Mormon might say that Joe just had to be righteous enough to receive the proper scribes that were truly called of God, or that it was all part of God's plan because he works in mysterious ways and all that bullshit. I don't think so. In my opinion, Joe finally had the wingmen he needed to bust out a working copy of the Book of Mormon. He needed some people that could keep up with his wit and imagination and also believed all the crazy same shit he did. So that's exactly what he found in Cowdung and David Whitmer. Thirdly, Martin Harris wasn't involved at all with the translation at this point. However, he was bankrolling the whole thing and even gave Joe and Emma some money to cover living expenses while Joe was translating in lieu of working. This may only seem like freeloading now, but when it comes time for Marty to throw the farm in hock for the printing fee, this becomes a bit of an issue. This issue barely gets resolved using the other 10 witnesses of the plates, which Marty becomes convinced with, and follows through with funding the print of the Book of Mormon. But we'll cover that when we cover all the witnesses. Alright, on to the next topic with respect to Cowdung and Joe. Earlier we read the Joseph Smith history about them starting the translation on April 7th, 1829. Well, there's a bit more after that I think is worth reading. This is Joseph Smith History, 68 through 72. Quote, "We still continued the work of translation, when, in the ensuing month, May 1829, we on a certain day went into the woods to pray and inquire of the Lord respecting baptisms for the remission of sins, that we found mentioned in the translation of the plates. While we were thus employed, praying and calling upon the Lord, a messenger from heaven descended in a cloud of light, and having laid his hands upon us, he ordained us, saying, Upon you, my fellow servants, in the name of Messiah, I confer the priesthood of Aaron, which holds the keys of the ministering of angels and of the gospel of repentance and baptism by immersion for the remission of sins. And this shall never be taken again from the earth until the sons of Levi do offer again an offering unto the Lord in righteousness. He said this Aaronic priesthood had not the power of laying on the hands for the gift of the Holy Ghost, but that this should be conferred on us hereafter. And he commanded us to go and be baptized, and he gave us directions that I should baptize Oliver Cowdery, and that afterwards he should baptize me. So that basically said that they got the Aaronic priesthood, and then they needed to baptize each other, and then they would have the priesthood that has the power of the laying on of hands for the gift of the Holy Ghost conferred on them afterwards. 71, quote, Accordingly we went and were baptized. I baptized him first, and afterwards he baptized me. After which I laid my hands upon his head, and ordained him to the Aaronic priesthood, and afterwards he laid his hands on me, and ordained me to the same priesthood, for so we were commanded. Yeah, did you hear that page turn? Yeah, that's because I'm reading this from my quad. That's right, I'm reading this from my original sticks. The messenger who visited us on this occasion and conferred this priesthood upon us said that his name was John, the same that is called John the Baptist in the New Testament, and that he acted under the direction of Peter, James, and John, who held the keys of the priesthood of Melchizedek, which priesthood, he said, would in due time be conferred on us, and that I should be called the first elder of the church, and he, meaning Oliver Cowdery, the second. It was on the 15th day of May 1829 that we were ordained under the hand of this messenger and baptized. Basically, that just detailed an account of how the priesthood was restored to the earth. For listeners unfamiliar with the Mormon jargon of priesthood, it doesn't mean being a member of the church hierarchy. The priesthood is something that every 12-year-old gets in the church. That's the Aaronic priesthood anyway. That's the priesthood that we have the explicit detail from the Joseph Smith history of the angel of John the Baptist conferring on Joe and Cowdung. However, we don't really have this level of detail when it comes to the Melchizedek priesthood being restored. The Melchizedek priesthood is the one that young men usually receive when they turn 18. The year from 18 to 19 in the Mormon Church used to be a year of intense spiritual and monetary preparation for young men about to turn missionary. That was until recently when the missionary age was lowered to 18. But one big part of that preparation is receiving the Melchizedek priesthood, so you can do all the ordinances necessary while on your mission. That was just an explanatory side note about the two different levels of the priesthood in the Mormon Church, the Aaronic and the Melchizedek. The only thing we know about the restoration of the Melchizedek priesthood is Joe recorded that he and Cowdung would be ordained with it later. Nothing beyond that, which most historians assume to be within the following 2 weeks after they received the Aaronic priesthood and baptized each other. Once again, we run into some problems with the claims being made. I'm going to string out a series of quotes from people you may or may not recognize, but I'll summarize it after. So this is an interview with David Whitmer and Zenas H. Gurley in 1885. Quote, Question, were you present when Joseph Smith received the revelation commanding him and Oliver Cowdery to ordain each other to the Melchizedek priesthood? If so, where was it and how? Answer, no, I was not. Neither did I ever hear of such a thing as an angel ordaining them until I got into Ohio about the year 1834 or later. Next question. Can you tell why Joseph and Oliver were ordained to the lesser priesthood by the hand of an angel, but in receiving the higher they ordained each other? Answer. I moved Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery to my father's house in Fayette, New York, from Harmony, Pennsylvania, in the year 1829. On our way, I conversed freely with them upon this great work they were bringing about, and Oliver stated to me in Joseph's presence that they had baptized each other, seeking by that to fulfill the command. And after our arrival at our father's sometime in June 1829, Joseph ordained Oliver Cowdery to be an elder, and Oliver ordained Joseph to be an elder in the Church of Christ. And during that year, Joseph both baptized and ordained me an elder in the Church of Christ. This was all coming from the mouth of David Whitmer. It continues, quote, also during this year, the translation of the Book of Mormon was finished, and we preached, baptized, and ordained some as elders. And on the 6th day of April, 1830, 6 elders, together with some 50 or 60, as near as I can recollect, of the members met together to effect an organization. He was referring to the first meeting of the church, April 6th, 1830. It goes on, quote, I never heard that an angel had ordained Joseph and Oliver to the Aaronic priesthood until the year 1834, 5, or 6 in Ohio. My information from Joseph and Oliver upon this matter being as I have stated, and that they were commanded so to do by revealment through Joseph. I do not believe that John the Baptist ever ordained Joseph and Oliver as stated and believed by some. I regard that as an error, a misconception. That's the end of the interview with David Whitmer in 1885. Oof, ouch. That really couldn't have been much more clear. Earlier than this interview, Orson Pratt asked David Whitmer in an 1878 interview if he could recall the details of the bestowal of the apostleship on Joe and Cowdung by the apostles Peter, James, and John. He said, quote, I do not know. Joseph never told me. I can only tell you what I know, for I will not testify to anything I do not know. End quote. A little emphatic, wasn't he? And that was from David Whitmer, one of the 3 witnesses of the plates, who had also been ordained an apostle with the Melchizedek priesthood. He didn't even know the origins of it, and he was a founding father of the church. Let's go on to the next one. This was a letter written by Edward Stevenson to Apostle Franklin D. Richards, and is cited in the Stevenson Family History, 1955, by Joseph Grant Stevenson. The letter is kind of long, but I will only be highlighting the important parts and including other points to help to tie the storyline together. Quote, Dear Brother F.D. Richards, I take pleasure in addressing a few lines to you. My journey to this place has been attended with blessings. I called on David Whitmer soon after breakfast at the Huggins house and spent until 2 p.m. I took dinner with David and his only son, David, and a son of one of the 8 witnesses by the name of Page. We'll find out who that is later. Quote, David seems quite pleased to receive me and asked me to ask a blessing on the food. Of course he bore a very strong testimony, and although very feeble in body, he was talkative, but he said many things that were not to go out to the world that he talked about. I wish I could have been a fly on the wall for that conversation. It goes on, quote, he said the signs of time to him indicate great events. He has no sympathy with the Josephites or others. Now, when he says the term Josephites here, he probably doesn't make a lot of sense right now, but when we cover the breakup of all the factions of Mormonism, that will have a little more context to it. It continues, quote, I inquired of David, meaning David Whitmer, and young David, David Whitmer's son, and also of Philander A. Page, that's the Page he was referring to earlier, aged 54, son of Hiram Page, who was one of the 8 witnesses, and also John Whitmer, in whose hands the records are. All and separately who say that they do not have any knowledge of, neither do the records show concerning Peter, James, and John's coming to the prophet Joseph. On this, and also on the John the Baptist mission, they seem all of them very ignorant. David said the prophet of God received the command from God, and that was sufficient authority. He did not seem to understand the necessity of the connecting link of ordination. So basically, he's saying when he inquired all of these people about Peter, James, and John bestowing the Melchizedek priesthood on Joseph and Oliver, all of these guys are like, what the fuck are you talking about? We have no idea what's going on. So let's continue on. Quote, they are very dark on the subject of the sealing power, as also baptisms for the dead. Now, when he says sealing and baptisms for the dead, he's referring to currently practiced Mormon rituals that are performed inside the Mormon temples. Apparently, everybody here was completely ignorant on both of those subjects as well, even though they were supposedly founding doctrines of the church. This all harkens to the splitting of the various factions before and after Joe died, because remember this interview was in 1878, 34 years after Joe died. The letter continues, quote, "He showed me again the manuscript and the copy of the characters of the plates as copied, and says they are the identical ones taken by Martin to Professor Anthon. This just affirmed that the characters manuscript that we talked about last episode was indeed authentic." The letter goes on to describe David Whitmer being nearly on his deathbed for this interview, which we will probably finish covering next episode when we talk about David instead of Cowdung. The next person I'm going to quote is William E. McLellin. He was an early convert to the church in 1831, but he later became one of the original 12 apostles in 1835 and was excommunicated in 1838 for blaspheming against church leaders. Of course. This is from an insider's view of Mormon origins by Grant Palmer on page 244. Quote, "I joined the church in 1831. For years I have never heard of John the Baptist ordaining Joseph and Oliver. I heard not of James, Peter, and John doing so. I heard Joseph tell his experience of ordination by Cowdery and the organization of the church probably more than 20 times to persons who, near the rise of the church, wished to know and hear about it. I never heard of Moroni, John, or Peter, James, and John at the ordination till it was told some years later afterward in Ohio." He was later quoted saying, quote, "Although I carefully noticed things that were said, today I do not believe the story." End quote. Well, we have two sides to the story of how the priesthood authority was supposedly bestowed on the founding members of the church. On one side, we have Joe claiming that he and Cowdung received the Aaronic priesthood from John the Baptist, and following that ordination, Joe and Cowdung baptized each other. Some unknown and unrecorded time after that, believed to be within the following 2 weeks, Joe and Cowdung received the holy Melchizedek priesthood and began to set up the church with proper keys and authority. On the flip side, we don't have a single other record substantiating Joe's claim. But we do have lots of claims from multiple people saying the opposite from Joe's claim. We essentially have 6 people claiming that Joe's story of the priesthood being restored onto the earth was just completely fabricated, which seems to comport with the available evidence. But why would Joe do this? We can't be sure, but I can surely guess. I would argue that Joe was flying by the seat of his pants when the church was first founded. He didn't even form the apostleship until 4 years after the first meeting of the church in 1830. I bet there were power struggles going on. Joe was slowly gaining more and more followers, which all had different opinions of how they thought the church should be. So, probably in a panic, Joe said there needs to be 12 apostles in the church, all ordained with the highest priesthood, or the Melchizedek priesthood. Everybody else just had to shut up and deal with what the 12 apostles and prophet had to say. Oh, and the only way that someone could be an apostle is if Joe said they could. When the lower elders that had just been uprooted invariably asked why did they just get arbitrarily demoted, Joe dropped a revelation on their face and came up with a story of an angel ordaining him and Cowdung with the super-duper special fairy dust while they were translating the Book of Mormon. Nobody could refute it, and it was an order that came from the prophet himself, so everybody either had to accept it or they were exiled for heresy. That sure doesn't sound cultic, does it? This is something that a theocratic tyrant personality type would do. Now, I'm not saying that tyrant isn't God's calling card because it perfectly describes the God of the Bible, but I am saying that doesn't really seem like revelation from on high, nor is it similar to any of the prophets of the Bible. Jesus was the only holy person in the Bible that ever had a hierarchy structured following. For the most part, the other prophets in the Bible are considered outcasts, or unilateral leaders of groups that are outcasts. Does this seem like a revelation consistent with the God of the Bible? I don't think so. Primarily because Joseph Smith fits so perfectly into the cult leader persona, much like Jesus himself, even without the influences of Yahweh. So I have to wonder, did it hurt when Joe revelated all of that stuff about the priesthood and apostles out of his ass in 1834? Or was his asshole so accustomed to having things like this ripped out of it day after day for years on end that it just didn't care anymore? Try asking a missionary that question. We're going to do an entire episode on just the restoration of the priesthood. But for now, what can we glean from all of this? You know, I'm not really sure. We've only been introduced to a small handful of characters in this massive story so far, and we've only spent a single episode on the founding prophet himself. Our narrative basically halted after episode 1 when Joe pulled the plates from the ground. After that, we only talked about the next 3 integral characters that play a big part in the authorship of the Book of Mormon. Let's review the important characters aside from Joseph Smith himself up to this point. In episode 2, we talked about his wife, the lovely Emma. She's tall and suave and very mild, and will later come to be known as Sister Emma, and then Mother Emma after that, both for her formative role in the split-off faction of Mormonism and because of her maternal attitude towards the saints in the towns they lived in. She obviously cared for people and loved humanity so very much, almost as much as she loved Joe. Even when she was on her deathbed, she refused to besmirch the name and work of her husband by telling the truth about the polygamy charges, even though it was well after his death. Emma Smith provides the moral support beam and safety net for Joe, regardless of what he gets into. Whether that meant looking the other way when he was blatantly plagiarizing the contents of a currently printed book for the contents of the Book of Mormon, or peeling dried hot tar and feathers off Joe's burned skin during the church's multiple persecutions and exoduses. She held him up, right up until the gunfight that ended in his death and left her pregnant and widowed. After that, we talked about Martin Harris. We call him Not So Smarty Marty because, quite frankly, his credulity makes him a fucking idiot. He was a stern but honest man in all of his business dealings, but had quite a predisposition towards anything spiritual or relating to God. He also owned a fairly large and relatively successful farm of some 240 acres, until he met Joe at least, the value of which was estimated to be $5,000 to $7,000. This farm was primarily purchased with a large sum inheritance that Marty built his entire financial profile on. Altogether, the man was worth an estimated $10,000, including all his assets and interests. That's close to $250,000 today, but all that money can attract a lot of unwanted snake oil salesmen. Joe was the first to finally sink his teeth into Marty's wallet, and he sucked the poor thing dry. Before the Book of Mormon was printed, and after Marty agreed to invest in Joe, he fought constantly with his wife, beating her black and blue with a bullwhip on one documented occasion, even though it was probably a pretty frequent occurrence. He had an affair with another woman that was living in his neighborhood at the time, according to his wife, that was collaborated with the New York Census at the time. An affair which he didn't even seem terribly apologetic about. This affair led to a divorce around the same time that the note came due to pay the printer for publishing the Book of Mormon, and Marty lost everything he had. The farm, his wife, his rich friends in the area, everything he knew was gone, and Marty was officially destitute. He resolved to trying to sell the plates and Urim and Thummim to a scholar that we knew as Not So Smarty Marty Super Study Smarty Party Pooper Pal Charlie Anthon, which was the same scholar that looked at a copy of some of the inscriptions that were supposedly on the plates, called the Characters Manuscript, and Charlie basically laughed Marty out of his house when Marty offered to sell everything to him. In this episode, we talked about Oliver Cowdery, aka Cowdung Allover. Not only was he slender with dark wavy hair and piercing eyes and a chiseled jaw, that was a description taken from ldsces.org, but he also had a charming and collected personality. He was also Joe's mom's third cousin, and we can reasonably assume that Cowdung and Joe knew each other growing up. Cowdung was quick as a whip and was a man, quote, whose wit was seldom matched in a debate, unquote. He was barely a year younger than Joe and had a lot of charisma and drive for Jesus. He just so happened to know the ins and outs of the printing business, which made him a fine scribe and editor for really, really cheap. Luckily for Joe, not only did he love him some Jesus, but he also loved him some scrying and dowsing, which is something that they shared in common. Cowdung's dad and Joe's dad were part of the same treasure hunting cult, so it's really no wonder where Joe and Cowdung picked it up from, nor is it any sort of mystery how Joe and Cowdung miraculously came together to translate the plates. This led to Cowdung and Joe being the first supposed possessors of the priesthood that was allegedly ordained by Peter, James, and John the Baptist, but was refuted by claims by 6 other people. The next episode, we will talk about David Whitmer and Sidney Rigdon. We can't finish up the translation in our actual narrative until they are introduced. After we do in-depth analyses of these two gents, we will pick up where the narrative officially left off at the end of episode 1. Emma praying in the carriage while Joe digs up the plates and hides them in a tree. We will try to cover the entire translation as it possibly handed, and I will try to include as much material as possible relating to the source information for the Book of Mormon. I have said before that Joseph Smith was a great synthesizer of information. He had an uncanny ability to draw information from multiple sources and put his own twist on it so as not to betray its source. So the places he took the information for the Book of Mormon from are very far and wide. I hope that I'll be able to shock you with some of the comparisons that are drawn from material that was available to Joe at the time to the Book of Mormon, once we finally dive into the analysis of it. Mormons love to say that there's no way that Joe could have had the mental capacity to author such a book in such a short amount of time, but when we examine the source material he could have used and compare it with an actual timeline of when Joe could have been writing this book and take into account the various people that were involved, we will be able to make our own judgment of this popular Mormon claim. I hope this episode was stimulating enough. We didn't really have as much information about Cowdung Allover to go on as we did about the others we have analyzed, but the time before he was a scribe is nowhere near as important as his time during and after the translation. That's when things start to get fun. I know that these biography episodes are probably excruciating, but please bear with me. In the grand scheme of things, our narrative hasn't even begun. I so desperately want to tell you about so many crazy things that happen, but it's simply untimely to do so right now. But I guess that's about all I have for this episode, so talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. Hello there. Thanks for sticking around. This was wanted to continue reading one more verse in the Joseph Smith history after verse 72 because it's just kind of funny. This is verse 73. Immediately on our coming up out of the water, this was after Joe had baptized Oliver and Oliver had baptized Joe, or when it's happening, sorry. Immediately on our coming up out of the water, after we had been baptized, we experienced great and glorious blessings from our Heavenly Father. No sooner had I baptized Oliver Cowdery than the Holy Ghost fell upon him, and he stood up and prophesied many things which should shortly come to pass. And again, so soon as I had been baptized by him, I also had the spirit of prophecy. When, standing up, I prophesied concerning the rise of the church and many other things connected with the church and this generation of the children of men. We were filled with the Holy Ghost and rejoiced in the God of our salvation. Oh, I think that just creates such a fantastic mental image that you have Joseph baptizing Oliver Cowdery, and as soon as he's pulled up out of the water, he comes like up screaming, all these revelations, and the world's coming to an end, and I love Jesus and all this shit. And then Oliver does the same thing to Joe, and Joe comes up out of the water, starts spewing off revelations about the rise of the church and many other things connected with the church and Jesus Christ. But he doesn't care to write anything down. It's just, we had these revelations. We prophesied concerning the rise of the church. And that's it. That's the end. There's nothing more, no more information on it. If you want us to believe that you're a real prophet, prophesy of something that we can actually see happen. Make a testable claim, and then we can actually see if you really, really are what you claim that you are. That's just a little extra for you guys. Thanks for sticking around.